Okay, so like imagine you're trying to figure out what's going on with the economy, right?
Yeah.
But you don't want to wade through all the jargon and like all that speculation.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what we're doing in this deep dive. We're going straight to the source, hearing from businesses and workers and communities across the Western U.S. to get a real feel for the current economic landscape.
Yeah, so that's right.
So think of it as your like shortcut to understanding what's actually happening out there. We were talking about jobs, wages, prices, and then we'll like zoom in on some specific sectors like retail, services, even what's happening in like community support organizations.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's jump right in. First up, the job market. What's the latest there?
Well, the good news is that employment is pretty much stable. People are staying in their jobs longer, which is a good sign. And companies are saying it's a bit easier to hire now. They've got more applicants to choose from.
Okay, so does that mean like companies are on a hiring spree? Or are they like adding tons of new positions?
Well, not exactly. While hiring has picked up a little bit, there's definitely a sense of caution among businesses.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're not adding headcount as quickly as they might have in the past, which I think suggests some uncertainty about the future.
Okay, so maybe not a full-on hiring boom, but at least things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
What about wages? Are those keeping up with, everything getting more expensive?
Yeah, so wages are up a little bit, which is pretty typical for this time of year, especially with end-of-year bonuses being paid out.
Right.
We're seeing a little bit of easing in wage pressures in some sectors, like construction, manufacturing, and even some areas of business services.
Interesting.
But, certain roles like engineers, senior finance, and IT professionals, those are still in high demand. So we're seeing continued strong wage growth in those areas.
So it sounds like it really depends on what industry you're in and what specific skills you have.
Exactly. And there's this other interesting thing happening right now.
Okay, what's that?
We're seeing that new agreements between hotels and unions are actually making those jobs more attractive. So there's a chance that that could start to pull workers from other industries.
So it's like a ripple effect across different parts of the economy.
Exactly. Everything's interconnected.
That's a really good point. Okay, so jobs are stable, wages are inching up. But what everyone really wants to know is what's happening with prices. Is inflation still like a major headache?
Well, the good news is that overall, prices seem to be stabilizing. A lot of industries are saying that their non-labor costs are holding steady. So, those wild swings we saw a while back seem to be easing up.
So businesses aren't getting slammed with those like massive price increases on materials and stuff anymore?
Not to the same extent, no.
Okay, but is it all smooth sailing now? Are businesses in the clear?
Well, not entirely. They're still dealing with higher insurance and healthcare costs. And those are significant expenses that don't look like they're going away anytime soon.
Yeah, those are tough ones to avoid. So I guess the big question is this good news for consumers? Should we expect prices to stay relatively stable in the near future?
Well, falling energy prices, especially fuel costs, are definitely helping to balance out some of those rising costs that businesses are facing. It's kind of a balancing act, but overall, businesses are finding it harder to pass on higher costs to customers. They're worried about losing business if they raise prices too much. So for now, things are looking pretty stable on the price front.
Okay, so that's a bit of a relief. But even if prices are stabilizing, are communities actually feeling any positive impact from that?
That's where things get a little more complicated. While we are seeing some positive signs on the job and price fronts, a lot of communities are actually facing a surge in demand for social services.
Really?
Yeah, there's a huge need for affordable housing, food assistance, and mental health services. But the funding for nonprofits that provide these services is actually down.
Oh, wow. So they're being asked to do more with less.
Exactly. Which puts a real strain on their resources for sure.
What about educational institutions? How are they dealing with all of this?
They're facing similar challenges, stuck between low funding and those rising labor costs we talked about earlier. It's a real struggle for schools and colleges to keep up with the demand for quality education, all while trying to manage their budgets. It's going to be interesting to see how this affects everybody involved.
Yeah, for sure. So what about small businesses? How are they holding up?
Small businesses are getting a little bit of a break with inflation easing up. It's giving them some breathing room. But they're still dealing with those other headaches we talked about: high insurance premiums, rising rent, and, those financing costs. It's a constant balancing act for them.
So one step forward, two steps back sometimes. But is there anything working in their favor?
One interesting development is how technology is increasingly helping small businesses and nonprofits too to reach more people and deliver better services. It's becoming a real game changer for them.
That's really interesting. Could you give us some specific examples of how technology is being used in these sectors?
Sure. We're seeing small businesses use online platforms to expand their reach, beyond their local markets. And nonprofits are using software to streamline their operations, manage donations more efficiently, and even personalize their services to better meet the needs of their clients. It's really inspiring to see how they're being so innovative, even with all these challenges.
It sounds like there's a lot of resilience and creativity out there. So let's shift gears a little and take a closer look at how some specific sectors are performing. Starting with retail. How did that sector do recently?
Retail had a decent run. The holiday shopping season was pretty solid, about the same as last year. People were out shopping, and shopping centers were reporting good foot traffic. Outdoor gear was particularly popular this year.
Oh, that's cool.
And there's an interesting trend emerging in the grocery sector.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's happening in the grocery aisles?
Well, it seems that organic specialty stores are actually outperforming regular grocery stores, especially in those Mountain West states.
Wow, that's interesting. What do you think is driving that trend? Is it just a regional thing? Or is it like a broader shift in consumer preferences?
It's a great question, and it does seem to suggest that people are putting more of a priority on health and wellness, and that they're willing to spend a bit more for organic and specialty food items. It fits in with a bigger trend we're seeing towards healthier and more sustainable choices. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
It makes you wonder how traditional grocery stores are going to adapt to this shifting landscape. Were there any other surprises in retail? Any sectors that didn't do as well?
A couple of areas saw some dips in sales.
Like what?
Pet specialty items and wood products at home improvement stores weren't as popular as they've been in the past.
Huh, that's interesting. Any theories on what might be behind those dips?
Well, for pet products, it could be that people are cutting back on some of that discretionary spending for their furry friends. Or maybe they stocked up during the pandemic and they're still working through all that stuff. As for wood products, it could reflect the slowdown in the housing market. If people aren't buying or selling homes as often, they're probably not doing as many renovations either.
That makes sense. Okay, so retail had some ups and downs, but overall not too bad. What about consumer and business services? What's happening in those sectors?
Things are pretty stable there. The leisure and hospitality industry got a little boost from more group and business travel, but bad weather in some areas actually put a damper on leisure travel, especially to places like bars and restaurants.
Yeah, you can't control Mother Nature. But beyond the weather, are there any notable trends in services?
One trend that I've noticed is that more businesses are hiring consultants to help them figure out how all these policy changes are going to affect them.
So they're trying to stay ahead of the curve and anticipate any potential impact on their operations. Sounds like a smart move in this unpredictable environment.
Exactly. It shows that they're aware of all these shifting regulations and they're being proactive about getting guidance on how to adapt and comply.
Makes sense. Now let's talk about healthcare and legal services. Those are typically pretty steady sectors, right?
Healthcare demand is still really strong, which isn't surprising given the aging population and, this growing focus on health and wellness. But the legal services sector is showing a little bit of a divide.
Oh, well, how so?
It seems like smaller firms are having a tougher time than the larger firms. It looks like the economic uncertainty and that potential slowdown we talked about are hitting them harder.
I wonder if it's because larger firms have more diverse clientele and more resources to kind of weather these economic storms, while smaller firms might be more vulnerable to those fluctuations in demand.
Yeah, that's a plausible explanation. Larger firms often have more established relationships, wider networks, and, more money to invest in things like technology and marketing.
Yeah,
They might also have more specialized practice areas that aren't as affected by economic downturns.
it makes sense.
Okay.
Let's move on to the manufacturing sector.
Sure.
What's the latest there?
Manufacturing is showing a mixed bag of results. Demand for automation equipment is up, probably because of those rising labor costs we discussed earlier. Companies are looking for ways to cut costs and be more efficient, and automation is seen as a big part of the solution.
So even in manufacturing, we're seeing the effects of a tight labor market.
Absolutely. Now, demand for manufactured lumber products is flat, which isn't surprising given that slowdown in residential construction we talked about. And there are some interesting developments happening on a regional level.
Oh, I love a good regional breakdown. What's happening in different parts of the West?
Well, in the Pacific Northwest, manufacturing activity is a bit slower overall. However, defense manufacturing is actually picking up, driven by increased government spending in that area.
So a mix of challenges and opportunities in manufacturing, with some sectors doing better than others. What about agriculture? That's always a key industry in the West.
Agriculture is feeling a bit squeezed right now. Demand for agricultural products is decent, but crop yields are down compared to previous harvests.
What's causing the lower yields? Is it weather-related?
Partly, yes. Drought in the Mountain West is impacting grain yields. Growers in California are doing a bit better because the water supply isn't as much of an issue there, at least not yet. But even in California, there are some challenges.
Okay, I can sense a but coming.
You're right. Exports of almonds, which are a major crop for California, are down, and that could really impact farmers' incomes and potentially lead to job losses in that industry.
Why the dip in almond exports? Is it a demand issue, or are there other factors at play?
It's probably a combination of things. Global demand for almonds might be softening a bit, and there's also more competition from other almond-producing countries, so California almond growers are getting hit from a couple of directions right now.
So agriculture is facing some headwinds, but hopefully those will ease up in the coming seasons. What about log prices? Everyone always wants to know about lumber.
Log prices are going up, actually, and there are a couple of reasons for that. First, there's the seasonal slowdown in harvesting, which always reduces the supply of logs on the market. And second, demand from China for logs is down, which is also affecting prices.
Okay, so classic supply and demand issue. Now let's wrap up our economic tour with a look at the real estate market. What's the latest in residential and commercial real estate?
Residential real estate is pretty much in a holding pattern. High financing costs, largely due to those rising interest rates, and an oversupply of apartments are keeping new construction in check.
Yeah, it's definitely harder to qualify for a loan these days with those interest rates. No wonder the housing market is cooling down.
Exactly. Those high mortgage rates, along with those hefty home insurance premiums, are also slowing down the single-family home market in parts of California and Oregon. But remember how we talked about certain areas experiencing really significant population growth?
Right, so what's happening with housing prices in those areas?
Well, in the Mountain West, where population growth is strong, we're actually seeing home prices go up. So even within a single region, you can see very different market dynamics at play.
It really shows how local conditions, combined with those broader economic trends, can shape the real estate market in different ways. So residential is kind of a mixed bag. What about commercial real estate? Is that sector showing any signs of life?
Commercial real estate is another it depends situation. Demand for office space is still pretty sluggish overall. But here's an interesting twist.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
The best office spaces, you know, the ones with those prime locations, modern amenities, and flexible layouts, those are actually seeing more demand and even higher rents. So it's kind of a flight to quality happening in the office market.
Ah, so it's not just about having any office space anymore. Companies are willing to pay a premium for the right space, even in a kind of subdued market.
Exactly. Now, on the flip side, some retail and industrial projects have been put on hold because of that slowing demand and economic uncertainty. But government and infrastructure projects are going strong, which is giving some support to the construction sector.
So it's a tale of two cities in commercial real estate as well. Some areas are thriving, while others are struggling to keep up. What about construction costs? Are those still sky high?
There is some good news there. Construction materials are more readily available now, which is easing those supply chain bottlenecks. But costs are still high overall, driven by things like insurance, electrical equipment, and steel prices.
Okay, so materials are easier to get, but they're not cheap. Got it. Now let's wrap up our economic snapshot with a look at the financial landscape. What's happening with lending and deposits?
Lending activity is holding steady overall. We're seeing more businesses looking for loans, probably to invest in growth opportunities or manage cash flow in this uncertain environment. But demand for consumer loans, including mortgages, is down, mostly because of those high interest rates we discussed earlier.
Yeah, those interest rates are definitely a drag on borrowing for consumers.
Yeah.
It's making it more expensive to finance those big purchases like homes or cars.
You're right. And there's a note of caution here. We're starting to see some concerns about the credit quality of small businesses and lower-income households. This could be a sign of things to come if economic conditions get worse.
So potential red flag to keep an eye on. What about deposits? Any changes there?
Deposits are generally stable for now, not much movement there. But as always, it's important to monitor these trends and see how things develop in the coming months.
But we've covered a lot of ground today. Jobs, prices, community impact, and a detailed look at various sectors of the economy. It's been a fascinating, if complex, snapshot of the Western U.S. economy.
It really highlights how the economy is this dynamic, interconnected system. There are always multiple factors at play, and what happens in one sector can have ripple effects on others. It's important to keep that in mind as we analyze these trends and try to understand the bigger picture.
Absolutely. So based on all this data, what's your overall assessment of the current economic landscape? Is it a time for optimism, or are there storm clouds gathering on the horizon?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I'd say the overall picture is one of cautious optimism. There are definitely challenges and uncertainties ahead, but there are also signs of resilience, innovation, and adaptation. It's a dynamic situation that needs to be carefully monitored and requires a willingness to adjust course as needed. It's kind of cool to see how all these seemingly separate parts of the economy, they all fit together.
Right, it's like we zoomed out to get that big picture, but then we can zoom back in and see how those trends are playing out in different industries and different communities.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so valuable. It's not just about abstract numbers. It's about understanding what it all means in the real world.
Okay, so let's keep that momentum going.
Yeah.
We talked about the big picture. Now let's dive into some specific examples. I'm really curious about this whole automation trend in manufacturing. What kind of equipment are companies investing in?
We're seeing a surge in demand for robotics, especially for those tasks that are repetitive or physically demanding. Think about assembly lines, packaging, even welding.
So it's not just about replacing jobs, it's about changing the nature of work itself.
Exactly. It's about freeing up human workers so they can focus on the tasks that require more creativity, problem solving, critical thinking,
Yeah.
the jobs that are harder to automate.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that workers need to adapt and develop new skills.
Absolutely. And that's where education and training programs are so important. They need to be agile and responsive to the changing demands of the workforce.
All right, let's shift gears again. We talked about agriculture facing some challenges. What can be done to help farmers deal with drought and those lower yields?
That's a big question, and there's no easy answer. But some strategies include investing in drought-resistant crops, improving irrigation efficiency, and even exploring alternative farming practices like vertical farming.
Vertical farming. Tell me more about that.
Basically, it's growing crops in these vertically stacked layers, often indoors. It
Yeah.
uses less water, less land, and it's not as vulnerable to weather fluctuations.
Wow, that's pretty innovative. So even in agriculture, we're seeing these technological advancements trying to tackle those challenges.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even in these traditional industries, there's room for disruption and new ways of doing things.
Speaking of disruption, let's talk about the almond situation.
Yeah.
California is a major player in the almond market. So what does this decline in exports mean for the state's economy?
It's definitely a concern. Almonds are a big agricultural export for California, so lower demand could really hit farmers' incomes and could even lead to job losses in the industry.
So it's not just about the nuts themselves. It's about that whole ecosystem that depends on almond production.
Precisely. It shows how interconnected the economy really is. A change in one sector can ripple out and affect the whole supply chain and even beyond that.
Okay, so we've talked about almonds, automation, and agriculture. What other insights can we get from this economic snapshot? What's catching your eye?
One thing that I'm noticing is this growing gap between smaller and larger businesses. We're seeing it in legal services, and it's probably happening in other sectors too.
Why do you think that is?
Larger companies usually have more resources to handle economic ups and downs. They can get access to capital more easily, they have more diverse revenue streams, and they can afford to invest in technology and innovation.
So it's almost like there are two separate economies. The big players are doing okay, but the smaller ones are having a harder time keeping up.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it raises some important questions about economic inequality and the challenges that small businesses are up against.
Right. It's definitely something we need to be thinking about as we navigate these uncertain times.
Absolutely. We can't just focus on the big picture. We need to understand how these trends are impacting everyone, especially those who are the most vulnerable.
Well said. Now let's circle back to the community impact. We talked about that high demand for affordable housing, food assistance, and mental health services. What are some concrete things that can be done to address those needs?
It's a complex issue, but some potential solutions could be increasing funding for affordable housing programs, expanding access to food banks and SNAP benefits, and investing more in mental health services and support networks.
Those are all really important initiatives. But where does the funding for these programs come from?
That's the challenge. It really requires a combination of public and private investment, as well as some creative approaches to how we deliver those services. For example, some communities are trying out partnerships between nonprofits, businesses, and government agencies to use their resources more effectively.
So it's about being smart and finding creative ways to stretch those dollars and make sure they have the biggest impact.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that these social issues are connected to the economy. When people have their basic needs met and they have opportunities, it benefits everybody in the long run.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, we've talked about solutions. Now I'm curious about the future. What are some of the key trends that you're watching closely?
One is the continuing growth of automation and artificial intelligence. It's going to have a huge impact on the workforce and the economy as a whole.
Yeah, that's not something we can ignore. What else is on your radar?
The shift towards a more sustainable and circular economy. Consumers are demanding more environmentally friendly products and services, and businesses are starting to respond.
So we're talking about things like renewable energy, reducing waste, and creating those closed-loop systems.
Exactly. It's about moving away from that old take, make, dispose model and moving towards a more circular one where we're reusing and recycling resources.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about thinking long-term and creating a more resilient economy.
Precisely. And it's not just about the environmental benefits, it's about economic opportunity too. The green economy is creating new jobs and whole new industries.
So there's a lot to be optimistic about, even with all the challenges we're facing.
Absolutely. We're living in a time of huge transformation, and it's exciting to see how these trends are going to shape the future.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From that big picture view to specific examples, from challenges to opportunities. What are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
I'd say the main takeaway is that the economy is a complex and constantly changing system. It's always evolving, and there are always a bunch of different factors at play.
Right. It's not always about those black and white answers. It's about understanding the nuances and all those interconnections.
Exactly. And it's about being adaptable and proactive. We can't just sit back and wait for things to happen. We need to be engaged, informed citizens.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up, I want to give our listeners something to think about. We've talked about so many different trends and sectors. What are some industries or areas that you think are like ripe for innovation and growth in the coming years?
That's a great question. I'm particularly interested in how technology and healthcare are coming together. There's so much potential for innovation in areas like telemedicine, personalized medicine, and using data to improve healthcare.
Those are all really exciting fields. What else is piquing your interest?
The clean energy sector is another one to watch. We're seeing these rapid advancements in solar, wind, and other renewable energy technologies, and that's going to open up a lot of opportunities.
So it sounds like there's a lot to be hopeful about as we look ahead to the future.
Absolutely. We have challenges for sure, but there are also amazing opportunities. It's up to us to grab hold of them.
We've talked about a lot in this deep dive, jobs, wages, prices, and even like zoomed in on how all this is affecting communities. I'm kind of amazed by how businesses are finding ways to not just get by, but to actually innovate with all this economic uncertainty going on.
It's really interesting to see how things are shifting from this reactive way of thinking to a more proactive one. Instead of just waiting around for the economy to improve, businesses are taking charge. They're using technology, making their operations more efficient, and finding new ways to connect with their customers. It's pretty impressive.
It's like they're turning these challenges into opportunities. We talked about how they're using technology to reach more people, keep costs down, even deal with those labor shortages. It's like a whole new game plan for navigating this crazy economic landscape.
Exactly. And it's not just those big companies with tons of resources. We're seeing small businesses and nonprofits getting really creative too. Like that trend of using software to personalize services, be more efficient, and reach more people. It's a game changer, especially for organizations that are working with limited budgets and staff.
It's like they're doing more with less, which is pretty amazing considering all the pressure they're under.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, what can we learn from these businesses that are adapting and doing well? What are they doing that we can maybe apply to our own work or our communities?
That's a great question for everyone listening. What can we take away from this that can help us navigate these uncertain economic times?
Being proactive is huge. It's about getting the information you need, staying on top of trends, and not being afraid to try new things. And it's about embracing technology, but not forgetting about the human side of things. Building strong relationships, understanding what customers need, and delivering real value, that's more important than ever.
Those are some really good insights. It's like a mix of being adaptable and keeping people at the center of it all. We've looked at a lot of beta and trends, but it's important to remember that the economy is ultimately about people. How is all this impacting real people in their everyday lives?
That's what it all comes down to, right? It's about that family that's struggling to pay rent because the housing market is so competitive. It's about the worker who needs to learn new skills so they don't get replaced by automation. It's about that small business owner trying to make ends meet while costs keep going up. It's important to remember that there's a human story behind all those numbers.
It's about putting those human faces on the statistics and understanding the real impact all this has on people and communities.
Exactly. Those stories are important. They shape how we see the economy, and they should guide the choices we make as individuals, as communities, and as a society.
We've really dug into the data, explored the trends, and looked at how this is all affecting people. So what does this mean for everyone listening? What can they do with this information?
If you step back and look at the big picture, it's clear that the economy isn't this like separate force that just happens to us. It's the result of all the decisions that people, businesses, and policymakers make.
So it's not just about watching the economy. It's about being part of shaping it.
Exactly. And that means staying informed, getting involved in your community, supporting policies that make the economy better, and making good choices as consumers and investors. We all have a role to play.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for walking us through all of this. I hope everyone listening found this deep dive helpful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Remember, the more we understand about the economy, the better prepared we'll be to handle the challenges and take advantage of the opportunities that are out there. Thanks for joining us.